My name is Daniel Mercer. Until 5 months ago, I worked as a systems analyst for a contracting firm that did data integrity for a Department of Defense affiliated research cluster in southern Alaska. I do not have a badge to wave, no medals to show, just a thumb drive with files I was never supposed to see. I should not be alive right now. I should not be typing this in a rented motel room under a different name. But I have the folder, and I have a promise to keep. There are rules inside those files that saved one life and doomed another. If you listen to one thing I say, listen to those rules. If you decide to share this, do it carefully. If this reaches you, it could save you. If it does not, they will come for anyone who knows. If you want more field notes and documents as I can safely share them, consider joining the community that has started gathering these leaks. I did not plan to become a whistleblower. They forced the decision on me when they started calling people by the names of their dead friends. I found the folder on a quiet Tuesday in November. The office was all sodium lights and recycled coffee, servers humming like distant insects, and the archive room smelled of cold metal and old paper. My job was mundane in the way that keeps people from asking questions. I reconciled logs, verified timestamps, moved backups into cold storage. The building sat just outside a weathered airstrip, near where the permafrost line folded into scrub and muskeg. Most people thought our project was geotechnical monitoring and cryosphere modeling. The public name was harmless. The internal folders were not. I stumbled across a misnamed image set and a directory labeled Containment Legacy. The images had no right to exist. They showed rows of vault doors, frost-rimed like bell mouths, and inside, something that looked almost human wrapped in translucent film. There were protocol memos stamped Phase 3 and redacted appendices with names removed but handwriting intact. I copied the files because I had to prove to myself I had not hallucinated the room. Within hours, someone had picked up on the access pattern. I had a choice: hand it up the chain and watch it disappear, or run. I ran. I took the thumb drive to a rundown motel in a town called Kinross and texted an old friend I trusted. Jack Reeves answered on the third ring. He had been a logistics guy on an earlier project, now a bartender at a Fairytown tavern. He smelled of cedar and tobacco when he met me under a yellow bulb in his parking lot. He kept his voice low and his eyes lower. "You look like you swallowed 3 winters," he said. "Show me." We sat in an overpriced coffee shop that still had the heat turned up and unrolled images on my laptop. Jack did not flinch when he saw the vaults. He did not flinch when the files showed protocols labeled with a word I had not expected: burglamere. "They did not bury this under some benign name by accident," Jack whispered. "They wanted to fool auditors. You have to listen to what we learned last time." He slid a folded paper across the table, a handwritten list of rules and a crude map marking roads to a place called Mimir Station on the southern fjord. "Follow these if you are leaving," he said. "Follow these if you stay. If they come, do not answer like you used to answer." He did not explain everything at once. He gave me a phone number and a name, Tom Gallagher, who once worked in field operations and knew how to drive in whiteout. My decision was not a moral parable. It was adrenaline and the smell of ozone from a server room reading like someone had burned a file. I left town before dawn with a duffel, the thumb drive sewn into a seam, and 3 rules memorized. Stay mobile, burn compromised devices, never repeat your real name aloud near an open line. Jack and I agreed to meet again if we could not separate the threads. He said one more thing before we parted. "Do not trust recordings unless you can verify the signature. The mimic learns from sound. It learns quick." That line lodged in my mouth and tasted like iron. The road north to where I thought I might find shelter cut along a ragged coastline. I remember the way the horizon looked wrong, the size of clouds flattened by cold. I remember the quiet that sits on top of snow out here, like a lid.
Along the route, I stopped in small settlements, places where people still fix things with wire and patience. Pete at the gas station in Harbor Bay got me coffee and asked too many questions for a man who should have known better. "You look like you are hiding a story," he said. His knuckles were red from cold. I told him a story about paperwork and audits and a system crash. He nodded and gave me a paper bag with jerky and a local map. Maria Ivers, a waitress who cleaned tables while the ferry roared beyond the pier, tapped the back of my hand and whispered, "If you go inland near the mouth of the fjord, watch how the snow eats sound. It hides things." I nodded, but I could not stop thinking of the file name Berglamir and the phrase Phase 3. The first time I met Tom in person, I expected a man shaped by ice and diesel and regret. He had all three. Tom Gallagher had a scar along his jaw that moved when he spoke, like a map of an old fire. He kept his hair tucked under a wool cap and his hands steady, even when we were both remembering.
Things we had not planned to tell each other. He told me about the station, its original mission of studying permafrost collapse and the cryogenic layers beneath the fjord. He told me how funding got silly big fast, and how contractors brought in experiments under layers of secrecy and black operations that paid well and asked for loyalty in return. He gave me a notebook he had taken out of a locker before they sealed it. The notebook contained rules, but not just survival rules. There were behavioral protocols and containment axioms, and a list of phrases the research team insisted on calling documents to confuse outsiders. Tom read one aloud and then paused, his breath fogging the motel air. "If the mimic sounds like your sister," he said, "it will sound like your sister better than your sister ever could. You will think you are saving someone, and you will be saving the wrong thing." He wrote 8 rules across 2 pages. He would add more as we learned. We agreed to meet others. We agreed to try to retrieve more files. I want to pause and tell you about me, because some things you must understand before you judge decisions I made later. I grew up in a town where winters taught you how to keep a roof from collapsing, and summers taught you how to read the sky. My father was a mechanic who loved the way machines smelled when they warmed. My mother taught at the school and could recite the names of every student since she had started. I joined a contracting firm in the city because it paid and because I was good at patterns. I could see when logs did not match, when timestamps were forged, when a file had been altered to hide an image. I never liked violence. I avoided fights. I learned to read people by the way they touched a cup of coffee. Those skills were as useful in data centers as they had been in a small family kitchen. I had a sister once, Alina, who moved away and called twice a year. I carried guilt like a coat that fit too tight. When I first saw the images from the archive, I thought of Alina, because one of the log names had been partially redacted, but enough remained to make a name. I believed in rules, because they made the world legible. That belief saved me, and left me with nights where I woke with my palms wet, hearing voices that were not there. I decided to leave because the company I worked for had allowed experiments that treated people as variables. I decided to fight back, not because I thought I could win, but because not fighting felt worse. We fell into a rhythm for a week. Tom drove with an old pickup that coughed when it started. Jack met us when he could. Sasha Klein, a geophysicist, who had the kind of laugh that slowed arguments, lent us satellite imagery she had pulled from a server. Dr. Lang, who had been a cryogenics lead and who had resigned 2 years before the official press releases about funding, showed us how vault seals were meant to operate and where backdoors could be. Captain Reed, a retired logistics officer, found supply caches abandoned near the old airstrip. Elias Moss and Nora Hale showed up later, one a medic with a history in field trauma, the other an archivist who could find a misplaced file like a truffle hog finds mushrooms. There were more names. Each person had a role and a reason to stay alive. Each person brought a story of a friend gone missing or of equipment that stopped reporting. We were not a resistance at first. We were a group of strangers who had found matching scars. At roughly 30% into this mess, I need to ask you a question, and I will ask it plain because I need participation from whoever watches or reads this.
Which rule would you follow first if you wake up in an isolated facility with no way out and a voice calling your name that sounded exactly like your mother? Start your comment with "the rule" and then tell me which one. Your answers matter to the group that is tracking how public reactions shape the narrative. When you comment, include any small detail you think is obvious, like whether you would say your full name or not. We are building patterns from ordinary reactions. Please be careful. Do not include locations where you live or work. We are trying to make this investigative network safe and invisible. The rules we carried grew from an initial list of 8 into a living appendix. I will read some of them here because rules are what saved someone and because the list itself is a MacGuffin. They are simple and specific. 1. Never say your full legal name out loud near an open line or in the presence of unknown voices. 2. Verify any audio by cross-referencing thermal signatures at the moment the audio was recorded. 3. Burn compromised devices in a metal container away from flammable insulation. 4. Do not approach vocalizations that imitate loved ones without an external confirmatory signal. 5. Seal doors from the inside and create 3 redundant layers of thermal insulation before entering a suspected containment area. 6. Do not trust audio alone. Use a second sense. Smell the air, feel the vibration, measure with a handheld scanner. 7. Leave a marker if you move a body or a sample with time and location written in permanent ink. 8. If an entity mimics a human voice perfectly, treat it as a mimic until you can verify biometrics. 9. Use white noise generators when sleeping in communal safe houses. 10. If forced to choose between a person and preventing a breach, prioritize containment protocols that protect population centers over individual rescue unless a verified professional
orders otherwise. Each rule had a story. Rule 4 had saved a woman named Nora. Rule 10 had been discussed in the thin hours in ways that tasted like asbestos and regret. We added and rewrote rules as we learned how the mimic adapted, how the system corrupted audio signatures, and how the permafrost could keep both secrets and pathogens. When Tom handed me the notebook with the fuller set of rules, there was a sheet folded inside with technical notes. This is a short technical summary of what we called particles. The files described them as responsive microparticulates designed to act as a medium for biological modulation. They existed as aerosolized clusters that altered tissue responsiveness through resonant coupling. They did not look like viruses in a classic sense. They were engineered to exploit cryogenic microfractures in cells lying dormant in permafrost layers. The exact mechanism involved thermal coupling and electromagnetic resonance to trigger wakes in suppressed biological patterns. The description was clinical and terrifying. The particles were named, they were controlled, and they were meant to be activated under strict Phase 3 protocols. I am not an expert. I am reporting what we read and verified. We set out for Mir Station under a sky the color of old metal. The road twisted inland, and the map Tom gave us led through a stretch of tundra where sound behaved like glass. The sense impressions in those days are still clear in my mouth. The air tasted of ozone and rust. The snow squealed under boots like an animal trying to tell you something. The light was thin, and the horizon sometimes looked like it had been painted with a blunt brush. When we reached the access point, a rusted sign, half buried in drift, spelled Mir Station in letters washed out by salt. A satellite phone pinged an old maintenance beacon, and the record was stale by weeks. We parked a mile away and walked the last stretch with packs heavy with scanners and hope. The first time we saw the entrance, it looked like a wound tucked into the earth. There were support beams rimed with hoarfrost and a trail of dark melted snow like a river that had bled oil. The air had a smell I cannot describe without using words that sound dramatic, and maybe they are dramatic, but I will try anyway. It smelled like old laundry left in a locker room for months, and a library whose books had been damp and left to rot. There was a metallic note underneath, a tang like a coin on the tongue. The meeting in the sublevel where we planned our entry was the first time we operated as something like a unit. Inside a makeshift command tent under a tarp, we unrolled maps and shared gear. Tom, Jack, Sasha, Dr. Lang, Captain Reed, Elias, Nora, Maria, Pete, and I all had a role. The dialogues that night were long and exact. We argued about entry points. We debated whether to try to recover more files or to destroy the vault and leave nothing for anyone. We tested sonar signatures and thermal images projected from Sasha's tablet. The exchanges were frequent and breathy. "We go through the west bulkhead," Dr. Lang said, tapping a rusted pipe on the map. "No," Captain Reed said. "The west bulkhead is where they set thermal redundancies. It will trigger a lockdown." "Then the airlock," Sasha replied. "But that leads to the sublevel labs where they stored the samples." "We need to see what triggered Phase 3, I said. "If we can find the activation logs, we can understand whether this is a controlled release or an accident." "What if it is already active?" Nora asked quietly. "Then we run the white noise, we isolate, and we leave a tracer," Elias said. "We cannot just walk in and assume it is dormant." The conversation had the cadence of people practiced at argument, used to negotiating with a clock. By the time we left the tent, a plan was in place that felt like both hope and a bet with high odds against us. We entered through an auxiliary maintenance door 2 hours before dawn. The door was easier to force than we had expected because winter had made the metals brittle. Inside, the station smelled of bleach and old coffee. The corridors carried a cold that felt systematic, like a refrigeration unit made of silence. We moved in pairs and kept the white noise machines low to avoid jamming potential audio signatures that we still hoped might not escalate. The sublevels had rooms that suggested a carelessness in how they hid things. There were labeled storage boxes, boxes stamped with the word containment, and one wall of lockers where names were scratched out by gloved hands. Our flashlights carved cones of blue into the dim. We found a server room that had been intentionally depowered, but which held a backup drive, its casing cracked with frost. Sasha and I pried it free as Tom listened at the corridor with a handheld scanner. The scanner gave us a reading we had never seen before, a resonance that crawled through the numbers like fingerprints. "This is not thermal alone," Tom said. "It has an electromagnetic pitch." He adjusted the scanner, and we heard it audibly, a thin, high note that made our teeth feel like fine grains. Nora pressed her hand to her ear and turned pale. She whispered, "It sounds like someone humming." It was not anyone we knew. We found a lab with an observation window that looked out onto a vault. Inside, there was a body in containment, but not dead in the way we had imagined. It lay folded and swollen, and the film around it shimmered with a translucence that seemed to breathe. The recorder on the shelf had been left running, and the playback was corrupted. We tried to patch them, and the playback congealed into a voice that said, "Daniel, come home," in my sister Elena's cadence. I froze and did what rules told me not to do. I answered, "Elena?" I heard my own voice, and it sounded wrong. Tom slapped my shoulder. "No," he said, "do not answer." He pulled me back, and we slid out of the room as if the floor itself were trying to pull us in. The mimic imitates best what the heart wants. That was the first time I realized how dangerous old recordings could be. The attack came without warning. We had been looting data and leaving markers. Someone or something tripped a sensor. The lights snapped from subtle to harsh, and a klaxon that had the timbre of something mechanical and animal started. I remember the panic like a folding of space. People spoke in short bursts that looped. We had trained for things on lists, but training does not match the physical reality of being pinned in a corridor while a voice calls the name of your mother from the other side of a sealed door. Dialogues in that hour were rapid and raw. "Seal!" Captain Reed shouted. "Nora, Elias, pull the barrier." "It is at the door," Nora said. "It is imitating the medic who signed me off months ago," Elias shouted back. "We have to go or we lock ourselves in." "We do not leave Tom," Jack said. "Tom is pinned." "Take the drive and go," Tom said, coughing. "Get the files out. If you leave the data, they will rebuild." "I am not leaving you," Maria answered, voice breaking. "No time for heroics," Sasha said, pushing people to move. The mimic was at the door, mimicking each of us in the voices of the people we had lost. The creature had an intelligence that was purely adaptive. It learned patterns, timing, and inflections. It used them as keys. In 2 quick paragraphs of terror, I must tell you that we lost people. And we lost them in ways that felt like sacrifice. The corridor became dynamic with movement and the sound of boots on metal. We made a run for a loading bay, and in the chaos, a person I had grown to trust was taken, and I will carry that image until I die. We escaped into the open, and the landscape swallowed sound. The pursuit across the tundra was a weird kind of choreography. The snow ate our steps and spat them back randomly. Our breath came out like dry smoke. I ran with a pack that felt like an anchor and heard behind me the imitation voices calling our names, sometimes in chords like a choir. Tom drove the pickup as if he had been born to drive in whiteout. He steered us over a drift and the truck skidded, then righted. At one point, Jack reached across me and grabbed the drive that had all our copies. "Take it," he said. "You have to take it." I think he believed that I could deliver the files to people who would do something with them. He smiled, and for a moment he looked like the bartender who had given me coffee and a map. He was hit with a blast of something that smelled like antiseptic and copper. He spoke once with my name, and then went quiet. Later, we found signs that the mimic could instill panic not only by sound, but by seeding visual hallucinations at micro levels. It is difficult to describe that sensation without seeming melodramatic, but imagine noticing the exact shade of blue in a jacket in an instant and then watching that jacket dissolve into something wrong. The snow covered traces and erased their story quickly. We did not find sanctuary immediately. A small fishing hamlet a few miles from the station took us in reluctantly. Pete, the gas station owner, had friends and an uneasy tolerance for fugitive scientists. He let us use a back room and gave us stale bread and a place to patch wounds. The community reacted in ways that proved the complexity of fear. Some closed doors, some brought us blankets, some reported us to authorities with eyes that were apologetic but resolved. Jonah at the dock refused to speak our names and refused to open his door at night. Nora spent hours with an old woman named Greta who hummed songs and would not stop rubbing our shoulders as if to move the cold out of our bones. We met Elias's brother Mikhail in the church basement. Mikhail had run a salvage crew before the funding dried up, and he now made a living fixing nets and listening to people. He told us that whispers about the station had circulated for years. They brought out things from under the permafrost, he said. They moved technologies that do not belong to any one nation and buried them in code. The permafrost is not just ice, it is a library. These names we had collected in the margins would become important because people act in patterns, and patterns can be predicted. We planned a second push that was more surgical and colder. The plan required stealth, a decoy, and someone willing to stay behind to trigger a false positive. This required a moral calculus none of us enjoyed. We argued for hours. We weighed whether destroying the vault would prevent future harm at the cost of evidence, whether retrieving logs and images would allow public accountability, or just give the thing instructions on how to escape. We knew the agency that paid for the research had contractors who would spin evidence and bury probes in the public record. The plan therefore focused on getting the core activation logs and the original analog backups that had analog signatures tied to physical timestamps that could not be easily faked. The infiltration dialogue was long, technical, and precise because the stakes required it. We go in at 2 o'clock, Sasha said. Thermal drift is lowest. The mimic adapts slower at lower ambient noise. White noise set, Nora said. 2 teams, Team A to the vault, Team B to the ventilation head to block line of sight. Elias and Maria, you hold the entry and maintain comms, Captain Reed said. No voices on open channels. Use physical signals. If the mimic tries to mimic a comms voice, we cut the line immediately, Dr. Lang said. Do not hesitate. The dialogue moved like a litany because rhythm slows panic and makes people do the orderly thing. The infiltration into the southern sublevels was the central catastrophe and the reason I am here telling you this. We moved through narrow corridors whose walls sighed with cold. The air tasted like metal and old bread. Our scanners picked up signatures that resembled living tissue but were not stable. The vault had a pressure door layered with thermal redundancies. Sasha worked the ancient lock mechanism while I watched the corridor. The sound she made was the most human sound I had heard in days. It was methodical clacking and a low curse. We opened the door and found rows of canisters and a long corridor of observation rooms. Inside one room, the mimic lay in a series of growths like a coral reef, translucent and twitching with a rhythm that mimicked breathing. It emitted a sound that was not yet a voice but could become one. Back then, I thought if we could catalog its behavior, we could isolate its triggers. We did not account for the way such an organism could weaponize attachment. The alarm went off as we attempted to copy the activation logs. We were split and the hallways filled with a sound that mimicked the voices of our dead. There were a dozen long exchanges in that hour as we tried to save each other and not be fooled into betraying positions. "Copy the logs now," Sasha shouted. "I have 3 minutes." "We need to seal the vents," Nora said. "Sasha, get out." "I cannot leave," Sasha answered. "I can patch the drive." "Do it and run," Captain Reed ordered. "This is containment breach level. We have to trigger a partial burn and then pull." "Burn the backup but keep the analog," Dr. Lang said. "Analog gives us verifiable signatures." "Who stays to trigger the burn?" Tom asked. "Who will sit in the room and light the canisters so the fire takes the rest?" There was silence, then a sharp series of choices. Someone volunteered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said he had children and that if this stopped one more person getting hurt, it was worth it. He was brave and human in ways that made the rest of us want to be like him. We argued about alternatives. The mimic imitated the gravity of the voices we loved until the choices looked like windows, and we had to jump. We escaped with some logs and a stack of analog tapes that Sasha insisted we take. The station burned behind us in ways that the remote sensors would later call an anomalous fire of unknown origin. We watched from the shore as smoke braided itself into the sky and thought of the people we had left. The night afterward was full of debate. Some argued we had done the right thing. Some argued we had burned evidence the public needed. Captain Reed, voice gravelly from the cold and the long night, said, "We saved a population by containing a breach. We lost people. That is what bargains with science look like when ethics go missing." The moral calculus of that night is still a weight on my chest. In the weeks that followed, the network broadened. Journalists with contacts in the capital contacted us in encrypted channels. A scientist in Europe named Dr. Anya Petrov sent a short note saying she had seen similar particles in a thawing permafrost core from another region. She warned that thawing accelerates exposure and that release events could be spatially unpredictable. We started to coordinate releases of specific documents and to plant stories that would push oversight committees to ask questions. At first, the agency that oversaw the projects denied any wrongdoing and issued canned statements about environmental monitoring. Then, an official statement described a fire at Mimir Station that destroyed old equipment. The public narrative was tidy and bureaucratic. Our narrative was messy and human and included a list of names that did not appear in the official account. The epilogue of this story must be told in time fragments because the consequences have unfolded and continue to unfold. 1 month after the incident, rumors of unusual auditory sightings began to spread along the coastline. Fishermen reported that radios picked up voices during shoal fog. Schoolchildren mentioned names called from the water that their grandparents used to use. The community response was mixed. Some packed up and left. Some stayed and equipped their homes with white noise machines and thermal gates from surplus. The files we released had started a slow chain. Local health officials reported a few cases of people experiencing vivid auditory hallucinations and one case of acute dissociation.
We worked with NGOs to set up a hotline and a protocol for verifying voice signatures using simple thermal tests and analog backups. The 1-month mark felt like the beginning of a slow burn. The images that had been public for a week were being dissected on forums, and we watched as our decisions to release certain documents changed public perception. The boat that came to take some of the families away looked insignificant against the wide water. 3 months in, the Federal Oversight Committee convened a hearing and subpoenaed contractors. Some internal memos leaked showing that Berglamir had been a code name used to hide research into reanimation vectors tied to cryogenic tissues. The hearing did not result in immediate prosecutions.
But it forced a conversation and an honesty in records that had been absent. Our little network provided verified analog recordings that could not be corrupted. The public chatter had gone from conspiracy boards to mainstream news. We had created a new kind of pressure. The community of southern Alaska that had been wary began to organize formal registries of symptoms and reports. A handful of scientists came forward to say not all was evil, that some aspects of the work were intended to study how thawed cells could be stabilized to treat injuries. The moral terrain became more complicated. Experts testified that the particles could be weaponized, but also could be a potential treatment if reduced to strict parameters. The nuance did not comfort those who had lost people. By month 3, the mimic had been cited more often in isolated narratives, and local law enforcement reported more calls than they had staffing to handle. 6 months later, the landscape of consequences had widened. A controlled review had been instituted, and yet private contractors were quietly moved to new sites. The permafrost, warmed beyond predictions, had released an increasing number of dormant biological signatures. We had prevented one catastrophic release, but the files suggested there were other storage caches and other projects with similar aims. Our work had bought time, but not a cure. The network of communities that had learned how to test voice signatures became a model and a meme for resilience. There were vigilante groups who took the rules too far and burned possessions that could have been used as evidence, creating further legal dilemmas. A documentary team contacted me with interest in a comprehensive piece. I declined their initial offer because I was not ready to be visible. I still had nights where I heard my sister calling me from rooms I had once inhabited. The mimic had learned and adapted, but so had we. By month 6, the patterns made it clear that the only sustainable path was public oversight and community-level defenses combined with scientific transparency. The ethical debates continued. I lived under a different name and sometimes pretended that the other life was a dream. If you have read this far, you deserve to know what we recovered. The logs show that Phase 3 had been a controlled activation trial intended to test behavioral modulation using particulate resonators burrowed into frozen tissues. There was an experiment in which human subjects were cryostored and then subjected to wake protocols that used the particles as a form of cueing. The reports called them subjects and trials and used terms that made it sound clinical. The reality was less tidy. The community response forced a limited moratorium and a promise of reviews, but the technology and the knowledge had a way of leaking through contractors and through private collections. The final image that haunts me is simple and ordinary. It is of a vault door closing on a hallway that will never be fully empty again. I am sharing these files and this narrative because secrecy is not neutral. It chooses outcomes silently and then erases the unchosen. I will continue to share what I can without endangering more people. If you want to follow this, if you want to help us verify signatures or translate logs, consider subscribing to the channels that host our archives. Join the community that audits government research. Start small and be cautious. Do not say your real name in open spaces. Test voices with thermal confirmations. If you can help with analog archiving, we need people who understand tape recovery and mechanical timestamps. We cannot do this alone. The story is not over. When the ice finally shifts and the deep things begin to name themselves, we will still have choices about whether we meet them with light or with more secrecy. And the last thing I will tell you is this. Every night I dream of a sound I can only describe as water held under ice and then released. It is a long, grating exhale that includes the cadence of everyone I have lost and everyone I love. I wake with my hand on the thumb drive under my mattress and listen for voices that are not there. I am not a hero. I was a pattern reader doing what I could with what I found. There are still files I cannot release because their signatures will draw attention in the wrong way. There are names I carry like grief. If you remember one image from this story, remember the vault at Mimir Station and the way light looked on frozen film. If you want more, join quietly. If you want to help, start by learning the rules and sharing them. And know this: when the ground under our feet moves and the permafrost gives up its pages, the question will not be whether we knew. The question will be what we did with the knowing.